Hi, my name is Lauren Binford. I'm a professor of pediatrics and a professor of law at the University of Colorado. I'm with the Kemp Center for the Prevention and Treatment of Child Abuse and Neglect, and I'm here to talk to you about the first 100 years of children's rights. International children's rights was really a concept that was first conceived by Eglantine Jebb. Eglantine Jebb was the founder of Save the Children, and she was a British school teacher who was deeply concerned by what she saw as the widespread intentional suffering of children following both during and following World War I. Following the war, both children and adults alike were subjected to widespread boycotts, which caused them to suffer starvation and other forms of neglect on a broad societal basis. She tried to convince people that these children were just children and that they needed to be treated as the fully human beings that they were. And emblazoned with this passion, she climbed to the top of Mount Saleve above Geneva and drafted what became the Declaration of Geneva, which was subsequently adopted by the League of Nations. The League of Nations was founded after World War I in order to try and ensure that there was never another world war and that children and adults alike wouldn't suffer. Unfortunately, as we all know, there was another world war, and that ended up causing millions of additional children to suffer both in concentration camps and throughout cities in Europe, as well as Japan and other locations. Because of this, the League of Nations ended up being liquidated, and instead there was an international organization founded called the United Nations, which was intended to try and truly put an end to any more world wars. One of the first things that the United Nations committed to upon its founding was to develop an enforceable treaty that recognized children's rights, similar to what the Declaration of Geneva in 1924 was, but a much more expanded basis. Indeed, what ended up happening was a few rights that Eglantine Jebb had recognized in 1924 that was adopted by the United Nations became an expanded declaration of 10 principles of children's rights that was adopted by the General Assembly in 1959. Unfortunately, in subsequent years, we saw that children can continue to suffer, and that 1959 declaration was not an enforceable treaty. And so in 1979, there was a worldwide effort to start the drafting of an international treaty, which became the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. That treaty took 10 years to create, and it ended up being adopted by the General Assembly in 1989 and went on to become the most widely ratified treaty in the history of the world, particularly with regard to human rights. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child basically it has 40 substantive principles that look at all aspects of children's rights, from the rights of children to education, to the rights of children to be with family, the rights of children to protection from abuse and neglect. And as I said, it's been adopted by almost every country in the world except for the United States of America. The United States of America, though, contributed more articles, more substantive articles to the treaty and made more changes to the submissions by other countries than any other country in the world. And it also has signed the treaty, but it has not been adopted by the Senate, so it hasn't been fully ratified. In the meanwhile, there were 3 subsequent treaties that were added to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The first one focused on children in war, and the United States has ratified that treaty. The second optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child focused on the sale of children, the child pornography, as well as child prostitution or child trafficking. The United States has ratified that treaty as well, in addition to many other countries around the world. There's a third optional protocol that's been added to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and that has to do with enforcement. It's generally called the communications procedure, and what it tries to do is create a way for children to enforce their rights under the Convention on the Rights of the Child by bringing their complaints to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child that was created under the original UN Convention. And that has allowed many children to come forward, file complaints, and have their rights enacted, realized, protected by the country where they are residing. In addition to that, there have been children's rights that have been advanced by other organizations as well, most notably the International Labor Organization, which has promulgated several widespread, widely ratified treaties that have tried to prevent exploitation of children through harmful labor, and instead try and allow children to work in healthy ways where they can still go to work, go to school, and where their labor is not exploited and they are not harmed by the work that they do. There's widespread recognition that work can have a positive effect by children, but it needs to be limited task, and it needs to be in ways that don't harm them, that actually helps them. In addition to that, we've seen a lot of advances that have been made with regard to child health over the last 100 years. For example, the World Health Organization has made widespread advances in immunizations around the world, which has significantly decreased child mortality, especially in the early years. In addition to that, we have seen advancements made with regard to child well-being, but we are seeing that children are continuing to suffer in particular areas. We've recently seen a rise in depression and anxiety with children, as well as a number of overweight children, particularly in certain industrialized countries. We need to continue to keep an eye on these things. Unfortunately, we also are seeing overall advances with regard to child labor and education, but post-pandemic, we've seen some of the strides that have been made in these areas decline slightly. And so we need to make sure that we continue to have all children who are eligible enrolled in education, as well as a reduction in that child labor area. Despite the advances that have been made in the first 100 years of children's rights, the fact is that our job is not done. And we need to think about what we need to accomplish in the next 100 years. Thank you so much.